Welcome to Russian History Retold, Episode 322, in the case of the anti-Soviet Bloc of Rights and Trotskyites, Part 1. Last time, we covered the history of the city of Kiev. Today, we will cover a trial during the Soviet times because my brother, Alex, gifted me a copy of the court proceedings of the Kangaroo trial that included Nikolai Bukharin, Alexei Rykov, Genrik Yagoda, and 18 others. Translated into English, it is called, quote, Report of Court Proceedings in the Case of the Anti-Soviet Bloc of Rights and Trotskyists, heard before the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR in Moscow, March 2nd through the 13th, 1938. This trial turned many communist sympathizers outside the Soviet Union away from the Bolsheviks, some becoming staunch anti-communists. Fitzroy MacLean, a junior British ambassador to the USSR, witnessed parts of the trial and wrote about it, claiming skepticism about the veracity of some of the defendants' testimony. Of the 21 accused of treason, 18 were executed immediately after the trial. 3 were sentenced to between 15 and 25 years in prison, but all were shot after the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. Most of the men were old Bolsheviks, and some were very likely guilty of plotting to assassinate Joseph Stalin. Almost all held important positions in the early days of the Bolshevik takeover, with some being ambassadors to Western European countries. Here's the names of the defendants. Nikolai Bukharin, who was described by Vladimir Lenin as, quote, most valuable and major theorist of the Communist Party, as well as being Marxist theoretician, former head of the Communist International and member of the Politburo. Alexei Rykov, former Soviet premier and member of the Politburo. Nikolai Krestinsky, another former member of the Politburo, as well as a former ambassador to Germany. Christian Rakovsky, the former ambassador to Great Britain and France. Genrik Yagoda, the former head of the NKVD and perpetrator of the early parts of the Great Purge. Arkady Rosengoltz, the former People's Commissar for Foreign Trade. Vladimir Ivanov, former People's Commissioner for the Timber Industry. Mikhail Chernov, one-time People's Commissar for Agriculture. Grigory Grinko, the former People's Commissar for Finance. Isaac Zelensky, an earlier secretary of the Central Committee. Sergei Besonov, a Soviet state, public, and party activist and diplomat. Akmal Ikramov and Faizullah Kodjayev, both Uzbek leaders. We have Vasily Sharangovich, the past first secretary in Belarus. Prokopy Zubarev, a Soviet politician and statesman. Pavel Bulanov, a high-ranking NKVD officer. Then we have Lev Levin, Dmitry Pletnyov, and Ignatiy Kazakov, all serving as Kremlin doctors. We have Veniamin Maximov-Dikovsky, and this is somebody I really couldn't find much about. And then finally, Pyotr Kryuchkov, one of Maxim Gorky's secretaries. Vasily Ulrich was the president of the trial, but the person who appears the most in the transcript is the prosecutor, the brutal Andrei Vyshinsky. He was a close supporter of Stalin and had been the lead prosecutor at 2 previous Moscow show trials, as well as being responsible for the Soviet preparations for the trial of major German war criminals by the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. All but one of the defendants pled guilty immediately, except Nikolai Krestinsky, the former member of the Politburo and ambassador to Germany. He would recant his plea the following day and announce his guilt. Of course, he was very likely tortured that night to force him to change his original plea. There's a great deal of evidence that all of the defendants were extensively tortured prior to the trial. Of those accused, only 3, Pletnev, Levin, and Kazakov requested a defense counsel. As for the actual indictment, it is pretty obvious that it was an exercise in fantasy writing. Here's what it says after naming all of the defendants. Quote, they were accused of having, on the instructions of intelligence services of foreign states hostile to the Soviet Union, formed a conspiratorial group named the Bloc of Rights and Trotskyites, with the object of espionage on behalf of the foreign states, wrecking diversionist and terrorist activities, undermining the military power of the USSR, provoking a military attack by these states of the USSR, dismembering the USSR and severing it from Ukraine, Belarus, the Central Asiatic republics, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and the maritime region of the Far East for the benefit of the aforementioned foreign states, and lastly, with the object of overthrowing the socialist state and state system existing in the USSR, and of restoring capitalism, of restoring the power of the bourgeoisie. I mean, the last two counts of the indictment are the most ludicrous. None of these men wanted to restore capitalism, return the bourgeoisie to power, break up the Soviet Union, or have the country invaded by foreign enemies. They likely all wanted to get rid of Stalin, which is why they were really on trial. So where did the evidence come from that pointed at these 21 men? According to the transcript, much of it came from the previous show trials, and, quote, in particular, the trial of the group of military conspirators Tukhachevsky. The general's name is in capital letters, an emphasis that is quite telling. Mikhail Tukhachevsky was the central figure in the Trotskyist anti-Soviet military organization case. 9 men were tried in that case, and 8 were executed immediately, and 1 committed suicide before. The aftermath of this trial was even deadlier. It was estimated that over 37,000 officers and commissars were thrown out of the army. 10,868 were arrested, and 7,211 were executed for supposed anti-Soviet crimes. The person who was the focus of the blame of all of the anti-Soviet activity was the one man Joseph Stalin hated the most, Leon Trotsky. In the transcript of the indictment, it states, quote, this agreement between the Bloc of Rights and Trotskyites and the representatives of the aforementioned foreign states was facilitated by the fact that many of the leading participants of this conspiracy had long been agents of foreign intelligence services and had been, for many years, carried on espionage activities on behalf of those intelligence services. It continues, this applies first of all to one of the inspirers of the conspiracy, the enemy of the people, Trotsky. His connection with the Gestapo was exhaustively proved at the trials of the Trotskyist Zinoviev Terrorist Center in August 1936 and of the anti-Soviet Trotskyite Center in January 1937. However, the materials in the possession of the investigating authorities in the present case establish that the connections between the enemy of the people, Trotsky, and the German political police and intelligence services of other companies or countries was established at a much earlier date. The investigation has definitively established that Trotsky had been connected with the German intelligence since 1921 and with the British intelligence service since 1926. As you can imagine, Stalin probably had something to do with this. He was likely behind the interrogations conducted by the new head of the NKVD, Nikolai Yezhov. Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote in his book, The Gulag Archipelago, that he believed that Stalin even viewed part of this trial in a secret room in the courtroom. The transcript further reveals Stalin's hatred for Trotsky as they continue to name him as the instigator of all the accused anti-Soviet activities. As they write about Krastinsky's testimony as an agent of the Germans, quote, I established espionage connections with the Germans on the direct instructions of Trotsky, who instructed me to start negotiations on the matter with General Siecht. Now, page after page, the early part of the transcript keeps on naming Trotsky as the ringleader. Rakovsky swore that the deals with the British were Trotsky's ideas. Quote, I knew that Trotsky had been an agent of the intelligence service since the end of 1926. Trotsky himself informed me of it. Of course, this was a lie. All of the men were tortured and given a script to read instead of actually testifying to what was the truth. Another focus of Stalin was two countries that were considered threats to the USSR, Germany and Japan. While the British were mentioned a number of times, the two other allies were particularly targeted. Arkady Rosengoltz would testify that, quote, as the result of all of this, wrecking activities in foreign trade proceeded mainly along the following three lines. First, economic assistance to Germany and Japan at the expense of the USSR. Second, causing economic loss and damage to the USSR. And third, causing political damage to the USSR. Of course, all of the connections between the two enemies of the Soviet Union and the accused were at the direction of, you guessed it, Leon Trotsky. Again, we hear from Rosengoltz, quote, insofar as Trotsky had an agreement with Germany and Japan, of which I had been informed, both during the negotiations and at my meeting with Sedov in 1933, and of the agreement that had been reached at my meeting with him in 1934. I received corresponding instructions from Trotsky, and my wrecking activities in the sphere of foreign trade served the same purpose. Another reason for the arrests and accusations was to deflect criticism from the failed economic policies that were causing great hardships throughout the Soviet Union. The dekulakization that sent tens of thousands to the gulags and cost the lives of many more thousands were blamed on some of the defendants. As the transcript tells us, quote, the investigation has been established that the kulak insurrectionary armed uprisings that were being organized to take place in the rear of the Red Army were part and parcel of the plans and calculations of the fascist states which were preparing to attack the USSR, and that the right and Trotskyite conspirators were preparing to rise at the signal of the General States or the fascist countries. They were also made sure that the general public was involved in the numerous plots. Faizullah Kodjayev, a Uzbeki Bolshevik, in his testimony stated, quote, the main object of the practical work of our organizations was to prepare active anti-Soviet cadres and to train them in the spirit of struggle against the USSR. We accustomed the members of the organization to the idea that the fight against Soviet power would assume acute forms and would lead to armed conflicts. This is why we devoted attention to the preparation of the fighting forces of our organization. The indictment carries this further. Quote, the organizers of the insurrectionary bandit cadres relied only on the remnants of told counter-revolutionary elements, expecting to reinforce their insurrectionary reserves with the remnants of the Basmachis and the White Guards, who were to be smuggled into the Soviet Union from abroad, and with criminal bandits, inmates of prison camps, etc. This last group was added, in my opinion, to keep those people already in the gulags from returning to their homes and the general population. We see this time and time again in the literature about this era in Soviet history. Stalin's paranoia knew no bounds. The subsequent accusations are also related to the murder of Sergei Kirov, Vyacheslav Menzhinsky, and Valerian Kuybyshev, and the plot to kill Lenin. Menzhinsky and Kuybyshev both died of natural causes, but the defendants, especially Yagoda, claimed that they really poisoned them. Now, Kirov's murder was one of the biggest sparks to ignite the Great Purge. This was an important part of the indictment, as it gave proof that these men were not only capable of killing the leadership of the Soviet Union, but they had already followed through on it. There was also a claim that Maxim Gorky was murdered through poisoning, and as you might know, a favorite historical Russian means of killing people, by Genrikh Yagoda. It's no surprise that we see Leon Trotsky's name being bandied about in this section of the indictment. As Rykov testifies, quote, "I know that Trotsky, through his representatives in the contact center, did his most to defend animosity against Gorky. This is naturally to be explained by the fact that Trotsky was well aware that Gorky considered him a scoundrel and adventurer. On the other hand, the close friendship of Gorky for Stalin was generally known, and the fact is, he was an inflexible supporter of Stalin and aroused the animosity of our organization against him. As we pretty much know, Stalin was getting mightily annoyed with Gorky at the time of his death, and he was likely poisoned, probably from an order from Stalin through Yagoda. The doctors and Gorky's secretary were also implicated in his death. Pavel Yanokidze, the godfather of Joseph Stalin's wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, who had been executed the previous year, is also mentioned quite often in this section of the indictment. This is obviously important, as with him no longer alive, you could heap a bunch of blame on him and claim that he testified previously of the guilt of the 21 defendants. The plot to kill Lenin, Stalin, and Sverdlov is another interesting accusation against the defendants. The prosecution claimed that not only did they want to overthrow the government led by Lenin, but they also wanted to exterminate the leadership, replacing them with a bloc of left communists and left socialist revolutionary headed by Bukharin. They mentioned Sverdlov on a number of occasions in the trial, which is interesting as he died of the Spanish flu in March 1919. He was considered one of the first heads of state of the not yet formed Soviet Union. Interestingly, most of Sverdlov's family were caught up in the Great Purge, and almost all of them being shot between 1937 and 1939. Even though in the lead-up to the definition of the charge, the group was referred to as left communists, in the charge itself, they're also called the Bloc of Rights and Trotskyites. They're blamed not only for the conspiracy to assassinate the Soviet leadership, but also for, quote, systematically performed wrecking and diversionist acts in the various branches of socialist construction, industry, agriculture, railways, in the sphere of finance, municipal development, etc. And I really found it very interesting. I love the word wrecking. They use this constantly to tell there were wreckers out there who were trying to destroy this communist, socialist dream society, which we know just pretty much didn't work. Well, another interesting part of the testimony of some defendants was that many were opposed to the Brest-Litovsk treaty signed between the Bolsheviks and the Germans, which ended Russia's participation in World War I. He supposedly came under the influence of Georgy Pyatakov, which is why he was against the treaty. It was a convenient scapegoat, as he was executed the previous year in one of the other Stalin show trials. Others who died previously or were in exile were also named repeatedly, including Leon Trotsky's son, Lev Sedov. He supposedly died of acute appendicitis, although it is possible that he was poisoned by members of the NKVD in Paris, France. As a side discussion, Sedov is a fascinating individual, as he was much more vocal about the abuses of Stalin and his henchmen than his father. His assistant, Etienne Zabrovsky, who he swore was not an agent of the Soviets, was indeed a member of the NKVD. His involvement in Sedov's death is also an interesting story. When complaining of the pain caused by appendicitis, Zabrowski convinced him to go to a private clinic instead of a well-known French hospital. They performed the surgery, which supposedly went well, but did no follow-ups. A few days later, his symptoms returned, much to the chagrin of the physicians. He died a few days later in great pain at the age of 32. According to the book, The Sword and the Shield, the Mitrokhin Archive and the Secret History of the KGB, quote, "It is certain that the NKVD intended to assassinate Sedov, as it planned to kill Trotsky and his other leading lieutenants. What remains in doubt is whether Sedov was murdered by the NKVD in February 1938, or whether he actually did die of natural causes before he could be assassinated. Now, from what I've gathered in my research, it is likely that he was poisoned after the surgery, even though Zabrowski claims and swears he had nothing to do with his death. The transcript also points out that Stalin wanted the Germans implicated at every turn of the supposed conspiracy, as he knew that, eventually, they would face a showdown. Interestingly, though, most of the conspiracies they talk about occurred way before Hitler came into power. But that fact doesn't matter, as most of the testimony was, of course, torture-induced lies. The interrogation of Bessonov at the trial is one of the more fascinating reads. He would be one of only 3 men not executed immediately after the trial, as he would go into long, detailed discussions of the meetings between many of the defendants. He would tie the Nazi regime with the conspiracy to overthrow the Soviet government in the mid-1930s. Bessonov was also the star of the first day of testimony held on March 2nd, 1938. In the evening session of that day, and they used to have 2 sessions, one morning to afternoon and one in the evening. This was Grigory Grinko, where he talked about the plan to sever Ukraine from USSR, which began in 1929. Stalin was paranoid about Ukrainian nationalism, which in some ways is very similar to the situation in Russia today. Grinko, whose name in Ukrainian is Hirhoryi Grinko, was a member of the Ukrainian Socialist Revolutionary Party, and in particular, the Ukrainian Borobists, who were purged and executed en masse in 1936. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Join me next time, and we continue the trial of the 21 and finish up this short series. So, until next time, до свидания и спасибо за внимание.